Welcome, everyone. So, we have a heavy topic today, and one that I feel is so important. Despite loss and grief being a foundational and inescapable part of life, it is a topic that is not often covered. When I found out about Courtney's book, Sacred Tears, I was so excited about this book. It was exactly the kind of book I needed to read, and I think a lot of other people need to read as well. So, I am so blessed to be joined today by the author, Courtney Weber, so we can dive into this topic as well as this amazing book. Thank you so much, Courtney, for being here. You are quite well known in witchcraft spaces, but for some people who may be brand new to all of this, could you please introduce yourself and maybe talk about some of your work in the magical sphere thus far?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It was so much fun hanging out with you at Mystic South.
Yes, it was.
You're just a delightful presence. And so when you reached back out to ask me to be on the show, I was so excited to, get a chance to talk with you. Um, so my name is Courtney Weber. I've been, as most people can say that are magically minded, I've been a witch my whole life, but I really picked up the title when I was 20 and have been running with it ever since. And my journey's taken a lot of twists and turns, which is something I don't know that newbies necessarily can anticipate, is that your spiritual journey is going to have a lot of different bends in the road. There's nothing that's straightforward about it, and that's normal and natural. A lot of my work is about with witchcraft, tarot, and mythology as a guide, deconstructing some of the destructive thought patterns that are created by mainstream modern Christianity, and that hold a lot of us back in many different ways. So that's the core of what my work is at this point in my journey. And I wrote Sacred Tears as yet another one of those tools. So I had a loss about 3 years ago. It was pretty severe, and I wanted to read something that could speak to what I was going through. And the grief books were if the grief books had spirituality or spiritual components to it, it was typically Christian or Buddhist. And I read many of those books, and honestly, they were quite good. They had some very helpful things to say. But the challenge for me was the Christian books rested primarily on God has a plan. And I was in a place of, well, if God has a plan, then this plan sucks, and so does God. And I was also, when I would read the books on Buddhism, which I also found very, very helpful, there was much more of there is no plan. The God has no plan. It's all chaos, and just ride with it. And that also didn't sit with me well. There was a sense of, well, if there's no role for a higher power at all, then what good is it? And those are thoughts that grief makes us, has us think. So I wanted to find something else, and talking about some of the harmful thought patterns that Christianity has programmed in everyone in the Western world, and to one extent or another, especially here in the United States, whether or not we were raised Christian or have ever really indulged in it. It's still in the water, so to speak. That a lot of really well-meaning witches were unwittingly parroting a lot of the things, the unhelpful things that the Christians would say, which was, instead of God has a plan, it was the universe has a plan. When, Christians would say things like, it's what is, if it's meant to be, it'll be. I mean, witches would say a version of the same thing. And not only was I very disheartened by that, I also felt it just wasn't right. And it really didn't speak to who witches are. Religions have always been meant to help people navigate the tough parts of life, loss, conflict, sorrow, even having a context for great joy, which can be extremely overwhelming. I look at my toddler, and even when she's really, really happy and having so much fun, that can quickly flip over to a meltdown because her little self isn't really prepared to handle that much joy at once. And adults, we experience it in different ways. But unfortunately, religions often become the problem. Instead of helping navigate the
Yeah.
problems that are natural to living, they become yet another problem. Um, and so the beauty of a spiritual path like witchcraft is getting away from all of that, getting away from the trauma and the structure and the guilt, the shame, and all of those pieces. But it is, I also liken it akin to leaving an oppressive society and going out into the woods to live on your own. And there's a lot of merits to that. You don't have the judgment, you don't have the constraints, you don't have the fears, you don't have the abuse. A lot of those things you've left behind. And yet, when you're on your own, if something happens to you, you no longer have the support or the structure of the previous community. No matter how toxic it was, you still don't have the resources that might have been available. And that's what I realized was missing for me as a witch were some tools to help me navigate my grief. So if we're going to stick with the in the woods metaphor, if I'd say run away from the religions of my youth, which I literally did, like run off into the woods to live on by myself, and then I fall and break a leg. Okay, well, I don't have the rites, the rituals, the prayers, the platitudes, no matter how problematic they might be and are, I didn't have anything. So the same as if somebody falls in the woods and breaks their leg, they don't have the abusive society that they were once surrounded by, but they also don't have the hospitals, the ambulances, the medicines. So when I wrote this book, I imagined it as if I'm walking through the woods and I find another solo person who's out on their own and they've fallen and broken a leg. I'm going to open up my bag of elixirs and I'm going to offer them what I've got, things that worked for me when I was getting through this terrible time, when I was going on a healing journey. And maybe something in there will help them enough to get back on their feet, enough to get to the next person who has the elixirs that they need, or gives them enough strength to start developing their own, which can help them heal, which they can then share. The point of writing Sacred Tears, and perhaps I'm running right into your next question, was not about trying to create a structure or system for witches to grieve, but to provide tools that may be helpful in certain cases along their grieving journey. It's a book I wish no one needed. I'm actually about to send a copy to a friend who has just had a devastating loss, and I say I wish you didn't need this book, but since you've gone through this, here it is.
Yeah, I actually ended up with two copies. So there's the copy I bought at Mystic South that you signed, and then I had another copy that I sent to a friend recently, and I think that's been really helpful. And I wanted to return back to something you said about people coming from Christianity in particular. And I think that as magical practitioners, witches, occultists, we like to think that when we changed the labels on what we call ourselves, that suddenly we are completely enlightened and we have sloughed off all of that old baggage, when in reality, I see this so often. People carry with them into these magical spaces some of these old dogmas, some of these old ideas, and it can be a very long and challenging process to examine all of those beliefs, that language, and start replacing those tools, as you talked about, with other things that may more properly align with what they now believe or identify as.
Exactly. And I think maybe this is a topic for another future book. There's a very cold shock that believe a lot of witches and magical people come across when they're, you fall into your journey with what they call the zeal of the converted, or you're in your honeymoon phase with your religion, whatever you want to call it, and everything seems great, and you feel free and light and fulfilled and lovely, and then it's at a certain point you're going to run into something. You're going to find that the religion has shortcomings. You're going to find that you're coming into especially in really structured spaces. And I'm not knocking structured spaces. I've been in them. I've run them. I'm not really in one right now. Actually, I'm not in one at all right now. But, I think that the mistake is assuming that just because you've got, you're in a space where people are witches, that you're never going to experience judgment. You're never going to experience conflict. You won't have any sort of shame. It is different, and I would I like to believe it's not as prevalent within our communities as it might be, say, in a conservative evangelical space in the deep South of the United States. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
I mean, even Dan Savage was talking about this. It's like, people that go to gay clubs, they understand that, yeah, there's a freedom there to be gay, but it doesn't mean you're not going to get shade. You're not going to run into a mean person. You're not going to,
Hmm.
people are people. And even though that space has one sense of freedom, doesn't mean that it's going to be perfect. And that can be really hurtful for witches in particular when they find out that their high priestess is flawed, that he, she, they have all kinds of baggage and problems, and that sometimes they're not a very good leader, or they find that the group that they've started working with is essentially dysfunctional,
Hmm.
um, or they're not getting the kind of spiritual support or fulfillment that is really calling to them. It's it is it, I also think that is leftover Christian mentality, that there is a possibility for perfection.
Hmm.
I'm seeing it more and more around books in the witchcraft world, which makes
Oh,
me
I'm so
quite,
glad you brought this up.
yeah, which makes me very nervous, because I'm starting to see more that if reviewers don't like everything within a book, or
Hmm.
they don't agree with everything in a book, that the book is not a good book, or that they should discard it and keep looking for something that is 100% accurate to its source material, that nobody has any problems with, and that completely affirms every single one of their beliefs. And that's really just looking for a new Bible,
Oh, yeah.
what it's doing. And that is really setting us up for fascism, to believe that there is that it's possible to write a book that has no flaws whatsoever, no mistakes, no typos, no incorrect references, and that you can agree with it 100% is deeply problematic. Again, and this is different than, say, a book that is blatantly appropriative, blatantly
Sure.
disrespectful, or there are problematic books. It doesn't mean that they don't exist, but the idea that a book is only worthy if it's 100% perfect and you agree with every part of it is fodder for fascism, and it is leftover Christian rhetoric. Right.
I could not agree more. This is something I've talked a lot on this show and like other spaces and I've written about, but I am deeply troubled by this current of almost anti-intellectualism that's happening, where people will outright cancel a book or an author in general without really delving into that. And I would say, even if you disagree with something someone said, or it's not your particular spiritual calling, or those religious beliefs do not agree with your own, have confidence in yourself that you may accidentally read something you don't agree with and it won't forever scar you. I mean,
Exactly.
obviously, there's some exceptions to that. If someone's in a particularly vulnerable place, don't expose yourself to something that could potentially be dangerous to you. But at the end of the day, like, it's so beautiful to broaden your world with different perspectives, different authors, different books. And yeah, thank you for bringing that up for sure.
Well, I mean, it's just when you look at Judaism, and you've got rabbis that are sitting there arguing with each other over 300-year-old interpretations of the Torah by some obscure rabbi most people have never heard of, and they're arguing over and finding fault with this interpretation. And I think that's absolutely beautiful, right?
Hmm.
And so I mean, I don't understand. It's usually, let's just go there. It's usually white cis men that have to go out of their way to let me know that they don't agree with everything in a book that I wrote. And I've started looking at this saying, congratulations, you still think for yourself. I'm supposed to write a book that they agree with everything. What's the
Yeah.
point of reading? And I say this very clearly at the beginning of Sacred Tears. Grief is a personal journey. It's an imperfect journey. And so writing about it is going to be deeply personal and imperfect.
Absolutely.
And I fully expect that every person who writes my book is going to disagree with me at points in it. And I encourage that, because I'm not writing a Bible. I'm not writing a perfect how-to manual. If you stray from this, then you're never gonna, move past your healing journey. And I said it twice. I'm like, once more for the witches in the back. You will not agree with me on everything in this book. You're not supposed to. But hopefully you will find one thing that you think might be helpful enough to use to move you just a little further along in your grief journey. That's all I want. And my biggest fear, and it's only happened once so far, is that somebody will come back and say, I thought this was the book that would save me, and it didn't.
Oh no.
And I have had one person say they thought this was the book that would save them.
Oh, that is heartbreaking.
And it's like, I'm so sorry that they are in a place where that they have to have that, but also in the belief that they live with that belief that there is a book out there who can save them. My hope is that they could find something in there, even if it's half of one sentence, 3/4 of the way through, where they're like, yeah, I can see where that might help me. Even if the rest of the book is like, nope, 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 then it's a win for me. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And so one of the things I guess for additional context on myself and sort of going off of what you just talked about is there's always this question of like, what do I call myself as a magical practitioner? And if we're going strictly by definition, my practice is ceremonial magic, and I have been initiated several times over as a magician. I have never been initiated as a witch. I don't do what I practice as witchcraft. And so when people ask me that, I'm like, oh, the most accurate term I'd call myself is, of course, a magician. And I feel like some of my other listeners, and viewers are in the same boat. However, the focus of this book is witchcraft, of course. But that being said, I personally, as a magical practitioner, found the exercises and the ritual components, as well as your discussions and explorations of grief and some of these surrounding concepts, very personally helpful. And I think, as you said, grief is something we all experience. So, I mean, I guess like to bring this in very plain words here, who would you say this is appropriate for? Is it just witches or broader people, or did you have other practitioners in mind? What would you say on that?
Honestly, it is a tool for anyone who's looking for a spirit-led book that is not in the Christian or Buddhist vein. One thing about grief is it does tend to tempt people to look outside their traditions. And for example, I'm not a Buddhist, but I read books on Buddhism and grief because I was looking and curious. And I think that, a very, very dear friend of mine who was pretty devout Catholic up until the end of her cancer journey, she began doing some deep research into the Kabbalah toward the end of her life. And that was a tool for her. But so I come from it from a witchcraft perspective because that's what I have. And at the same time, I do believe that there are things in there that anyone who is looking for something spirit-led that's not Christian or Buddhist, that they're going to find something there, that they're not looking for the God has a plan, and they're not looking for the God doesn't have a plan. They're looking more for we don't really know what's going on, but something's going on. So how about we work on it together?
Absolutely. And I think something important to keep in mind too with some of the Christian literature out there that's all about grief and loss is it is sort of I would say, dirty method of trying to convert people to Christianity as well that I've noticed. So it's really refreshing to have a book that actually provides helpful tools and a perspective that isn't all Jesus-y and trying to convert people.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
it's good stuff.
there's one book that I would add as my caveat that I think could be helpful for people of any path. And this one was written by a Christian woman, and
Mhm.
she's very progressive, and it's called Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I've Loved.
Mm.
And I was taken in immediately by that title, and I appreciated her approach because she's someone who has a long-term terminal
Mhm.
illness, and she's a mom and a husband. She's very young. She was under 40 when she got her cancer diagnosis.
Uh-huh.
Um, but a lot of, and I don't want to say but, and a lot of her book is about coming to terms with there not being an answer, and that maybe her faith doesn't have an answer for what's going
Mm.
on. And it's in some way, I say this with humility. Her book was so wonderful, and she's coming at it from such a different path. I don't want to say I picked up where she left off, but a lot of her book shows her confusion of wandering through grief when she's
Sure.
faced with that reality that everything happens for a reason is a lie that she has once loved. And she did love that lie for a long time, and then realizing that it wasn't true. and living with that reality, as a Christian and as a pastor. I believe she was actually a pastor, and that she was having to, experience that and sort through that. And so some ways after reading that, I wanted to give people first the space to say, yeah, everything happens for a reason is a lie. The universe doesn't have a plan for you. Um, and at the same time, this doesn't mean that we are lost souls wandering through this chaotic, spiritless, godless void,
Mm-hmm.
in the spirit of Anne Rice Interview with the Vampire. Like that's not how we're experiencing. I don't believe that's how we're experiencing life. But I do think that there is, I think from as a witch, it helped me to embrace the concept of mystery. Witches talk a lot about mysteries, but have a very hard time accepting them, and accepting that there may be a plan for this. I don't think the plan is that to kill my child in utero. I don't think the gods were out there stirring a cauldron saying, we're going to do this to Courtney. And at the same time, I can recognize that my experience is part of a broader tapestry of human experience that is leading us to something.
Mm-hmm.
And I have no clue what that is, and I never will. And none of us will.
Sure.
So embracing the kind of mystery, but not in it happened for a reason sort of thing, but in this is part of something bigger that I'm never going to understand. And as a witch, I revere mysteries. And that's one thing I would love to see witches embrace. Oh gosh, Lynn, maybe I'm starting my new book about the witch's mystery.
I love that. Please do.
Yeah, because it's like, again, and I'm realizing this as I'm talking with you, you're very good at bringing out the thoughts, is that we witches talk about mysteries.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we don't accept mysteries well. Human beings in general don't accept mysteries as well. It's why that show Unsolved Mysteries is so intoxicating and infuriating, and it is one of my favorite shows of all time.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like, we don't like mysteries, actually. We like to solve stuff.
Yeah.
Humans are, that's why we have scientists, humans don't like mysteries. No, we want to know.
Yeah, and it's actually really interesting you brought that up, because something this is off topic, just a little bit off topic, but something that's been bouncing around in my
I love
head,
rabbit holes. Go, come on.
yeah, is this idea of doubt in belief and practice and magic, and sort of the importance of embracing that type of doubt to allow things to be as they are, whether spiritual experiences, initiatory journeys, whatever the case may be. And yeah, I think it's a topic worth exploring from a variety of different angles. So please write that book.
Well, and then, I mean, it's one topic that I do discuss in, maybe we'll just call the book and all the problems with witchcraft and problems you're going to run into.
Mm-hmm.
But this idea that, part of being a spiritual person means you're going to have a crisis of faith at some point, and that you will not always believe as strongly as you once did. Life will not feel as magical, as kismet, as you're going to start to feel sometimes like you're just kind of a meat skeleton, zooming through the sky, which to me, I think is a spiritual, beautiful thing. But we're all going to have those moments where like, this is all crap. This is stupid. I can't. And sometimes it comes in really profound ways. I mean, it can come in for me, it came in the emergency. The most profound is coming in the emergency room. And I literally told my husband, I believe in nothing. Nothing is real. There are no gods. No, this is nothing, and that's coming from that moment of devastation, and then there have been times where I've been, at a con and I see somebody walking around super self-important in robes and things, and I'm just kind of cringe inside, like, are we really doing this? And then I've been in circles where people are in robes, and it's extraordinary and it's beautiful, and it's like something real is happening here. Or I've been walking through the woods with a friend and not in the robes, not in the ritual, and something extraordinary happens in silence, so, but I think witches tend to, other religions have the tools to combat the crisis of faith. Like, when you're feeling like I don't have I'm so sorry. I'm just kind of thinking I'm writing my next book proposal as we're talking, Lynn.
It's in my head. I'm also writing one of my next talks, so it's all right.
Yeah, I'm just like, oh crap, this might be the thing. We'll find out. But I just like this when you're having other religions have tools to address the crisis of faith.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, those tools suck most of the time. I mean, when I was growing up and went to Catholic school, we would have assignments where we're like, when do you not have faith and what can you do to get it back as fast as possible? Because then if you didn't believe that that little crusty dried up wafer was actually the flesh and you were taking part in an ancient cannibalistic ritual, if you didn't fully believe that, what's wrong with you? What can you do to start believing in that? Instead of making space that, yeah, there's going to be some times I don't believe in this, and
Hmm.
that is normal and that is natural and it is not a problem to solve. So sometimes if you sit at your altar and you light your candles and you're like, I am lighting a candle with a bunch of dusty looking statues here like a weirdo. What am I really expecting? That's normal. And that you don't have to be like, oh, I'm actually a bad witch and nobody, I should never do this and I'm blah, 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 blah. Um, yeah, that's not true. That
Yeah.
it's part of it. Sometimes it's going to go away on its own. Sometimes it signifies a turning point in your practice and that you're
Mhm.
going to start having your practice is going to change. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to abandon witchcraft, although it might. And that's okay. It's been part of your journey. You can leave. Yeah. So,
Yeah, and I think one of the most beautiful things I have had the pleasure of experiencing in the spiritual and occult realm have been when I come at them from a space without expectations. And I don't want to say without faith, but kind of. I mean, I come at it as tabula rasa and as neutral and as blank slate as possible, not expecting specific results or divinity to show up in this specific way. And I think that has allowed me to have much more profound, interesting, and personal experiences than if I were to come into these spaces or practices or, whatever, be like, oh, it needs to happen like this. I often see that, especially with new people too. Speaking of shedding old Christian stuff, be like, oh, I need, these deities to reach out to me in a specific way, and then I can start a relationship and start working with them. When in reality, at least from my occult perspective, I'm in the middle of scrying the Enochian Aether, so that's kind of what's coming to mind in this discussion. But allowing things to be as they are and allowing yourself to doubt, I think is very healthy and could yield some beautiful results.
right. And again, the idea that you are not supposed to doubt
Hmm.
goes back to that toxic Christianity. And I'm sure
It is.
you're gonna get some people like, no, Christians are bad. Well, no, it's not about the individuals. I'm a meat eater.
Hmm.
And does that mean that but at this, so I can also acknowledge that the meat industry in this country is absolutely deplorable and has so many problems with it.
Hmm.
And by speaking to the problem of how animals are treated is not the same as me saying that every meat eater is, it should be
Yeah.
shunned. It should not be, it's like, but I think there is a responsibility on behalf of people like me that eat meat to call attention to the problems within. Same as somebody who I had an art like a disagreement with a very good friend of mine. She's like, well, there are bad Christians and there are good Christians. And I said, if these so-called good Christians are not calling out the problems of the church, I'm going to wonder whether they're really good Christians or not.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, and I used to work with a number of excellent progressive Christians, and they were the ones that trashed the church the most. You know? And they were the ones that were trying to fix things. They're like, this is my faith, this is what I believe, this is what has saved me, and here's all the things that need to get fixed.
Yeah.
So I liken that to being a meat eater,
Yeah.
I guess.
Fantastic. Absolutely fantastic points.
Yeah.
And so I wanted, now that I have you here too, I wanted to get into some of the gems within the book itself to kind of, not to pull us back on topic, but I want to make sure we have a chance to, talk about some things. So, one of the things that a lot of people think about when they think about grief is this idea of going through the stages of grief or like this ladder you work through. And I think a lot of people are familiar with that. However, you talk about something called what you call the grief spiral. So, what could you explain what the grief spiral is, and is it a better approach to grief than the stages model that people maybe perhaps used to using?
Exactly. So let's just name for a second that the grief, the stages of grief, which were coined by Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, were never meant to be a blueprint for all grief. And Kubler-Ross even said that. She's like, this was meant to be an example of how some people can approach terminal illness. It is not meant to be a blueprint for all grief. Unfortunately, we're in this country, we like our boxes and we try to check them off, and that, and a lot of people, but I think that that's changing. I see more and more people saying things like stages of grief aren't real, and this is, but it's not, the framework itself isn't garbage. It's just being used incorrectly. And I think that where the problem is that there's an unwitting assumption that people have that once they have have a specific experience of grief, that's it. They're not going to grieve. Like, that's it. I've been angry. I'm over it. I've been sad. I'm over it. And so they can be surprised when they're, say, for example, they're, all right, well, I'll just use my own personal example. I lost two friends in a car accident when I was 17. And I went through a period of shock immediately after their death. I went through a period of despair immediately after their death. I went through a very rebellious stage a few months after their death, which I really equate to being anger. I was angry, and I was being 17 years old, taking it out by, breaking curfews and staying out all night with boys and things that I don't necessarily think I would have done, or maybe I would have, who knows. But I do think that peak rebellion phase that I went into, when I was 17 was really about, was a kind of anger at the loss. And then move on with my life. And I think I've moved past it. And then 10 years later, I'm in a bar, and all of a sudden I'm thinking about my friends and thinking about how they never stayed up too late on a Sunday night / Monday morning like I was doing at that one moment. And they were never going to set themselves up for a terrible Monday morning. And that was such a tragedy to me, that they had never lived long enough to have a dumpster fire Monday morning. Like, everybody deserves to have a series of dumpster fire moments in their 20s. All of my 20s were a dumpster fire. And I'm just like, to not, and I cried and cried and cried and cried. And, I've been, I think even in the last, like, while I was writing the book, I hit the space of anger again with their death, and angry at the way the adults in my life handled it, now that I'm much closer to those adults' ages and have a child of my own than I was when I was a kid. Just like, how could you treat kids that way that are grieving, and to ignore them and suppress it and be unkind and unsupportive? Like, how could you do that to the kids? And me dealing with some anger over that. And I think where I call it reason I call it a spiral is that sometimes you're going to be experiencing all these experiences that are often coined by the stages of grief. You're going to feel them at once. You're going to feel joy and sadness and anger and, acceptance. And then some, just as you would all these different points in a spiral right in the center. But as you travel outward on a spiral, those points start to separate themselves, and you might feel anger for a time, and then you don't feel really anything about it. And then you're going to hit despair again. But I think what's really key about the spiral is understanding you're going to continue to hit the points periodically as you go around. But just like it's a spiral, they expand outward. There will be greater periods of time between the bargaining and the next time you experience bargaining again, where you start rehashing, well, if I had just said something a little bit differently, if I had just called my friends that morning, then maybe they would have left 5 minutes later, and then they wouldn't have run that stop sign. And, all of these things you start to, and, but people start to think, how come I'm not over this? Why am I feeling this way again? I've already been through this. It's like, well, on a grief spiral, you're going to hit that point again, but it's different each time. And it's not always going to consume you, which is one thing I want people to know, is that the suffering that's involved with grief is not always going to consume you, but you will periodically hit those places again as you spiral outward away from it. Did I explain that well, or did I go down too many rabbit holes?
That was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for that. And on the topic of the grief spiral, you do suggest a number of different practices for it. And I really love the idea of bringing the tarot and the Wheel of Fortune into it. Could you talk a little bit about some of these practices that people might utilize for that, and maybe, get into like your tarot stuff as well?
So I'll try to remember everything that I put in there, because it's been a minute since I looked at that. But one of the things about the wheel card is that it can be the wheel and the tarot is a tricky card. So let's just talk about it from the quote unquote typical way it's seen through, which is the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, which shows a wheel with this deity-like figure riding high on top and this other deity-like figure being crushed underneath. Point is about a wheel that it turns, and the character that's on top is eventually going to get crushed by the wheel, and the character that's being crushed by the wheel will eventually be up again and not being crushed by the wheel, and it keeps spinning. And it's a challenge. It's a problem when we think that, okay, I'm no longer being crushed by this experience. I must be over it. But it's part of you, and there's going to be moments when that wheel is going to turn again. Even if it's been years since your loss, you might have a moment. You're driving along and you hear a song on the radio and you're crushed under that wheel again. But I think what's important to remember is that that's not where you're going to stay. The wheel is going to turn again. You're going to come back up, and you're going to be back in that space of peace and that space of calm and joy again. And so I think that's what's so important to remember.
Yeah, that's really beautiful.
Turning. And so part of what I say is bring it, I think at one point in the book I even said, like, take a picture of the tarot card and make it your phone wallpaper for a while, so that when you are having a moment, and the moments come up in stupid places, like you're at the grocery store and suddenly you smell a brand of detergent that reminds you of the summer that you were at the beach with the friend who's no longer speaking to you, and you miss them so much, but if you call them, it's going to be, and suddenly you're overwhelmed by this grief. It's like, why am I still upset by this? This should be behind me. When you look at the wheel and go, no, I'm just being crushed by it in the moment, but the wheel's going to turn again and I won't be crushed under it forever. So just to remember that piece of it, that I'm suffering right now. I'm not going to suffer forever because the darn wheel's going to turn again.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a fantastic idea and especially since so many of us are already working with the tarot, but taking that extra step to incorporate that in new and different and helpful ways, I think could be very helpful. And I guess just to talk a little bit about myself and sort of bring it back to Mystic South, and why I was so inspired to reach out to you and buy this book and tell other people about this book it was right before your talk, which was actually about this grief spiral at Mystic South. And I don't know if you were in the room or not, and overheard people like, oh, this is gonna be a really heavy talk, I don't know if I'm ready. And I was thinking to myself, it's like, oh no, I'm fine. Like, the grief I recently went through was the unfortunate loss of my mother, and then followed after that my pets. I had 2 rescued quails who were with me for about 10 years, and they were just a huge part of my family as well, and lost them. And I was like, oh, I'm over it. But then I was going through, the talk and hearing you talk about this and hearing other people share some of their stories, and it just hit me. I was on the bottom of the wheel again, as you say. And I teared up a little bit. And it made me realize, wow, no, I am absolutely not over these things. These are things worth examining, even if it is, last year or a couple years in my past, it's still a part of us. And so, especially with my quails, and actually, thanks to your book and all this work, I actually made an ancestor altar and included my quails as a part of that, which is something people don't necessarily think about. So I think that our feathery and furry friends especially can have a huge impact on our lives and truly be a part of our family, and losing them can be very, very huge. So I want to talk a little bit about that, because what is your view on grieving pets specifically, and how do you approach that in your book?
Honestly, grief of pets is severely underestimated by folks that have not experienced it, especially if they've never had a pet. But that grief is so real and so raw, and it's devastating. I mean, you've got to, not you specifically, but I think we humans have to remember that we bond with animals and have for hundreds of thousands of years. Humans have bonded with animals in one way or another, as companions, as support, as just a place to put our love. Like, we are intricately connected to animals within our lives, and have been since we came out of the trees ourselves and started walking upright. We've been bonding with animals. I mean, it's just, so when people say things like it's just an animal, is so ignorant. And it's 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 because it is a grief that changes you when you lose when you lose an animal. I mean, when my cat was put to sleep, I physically shook afterward, because she died so suddenly, and it was and I incredibly intense grief of, what could I have done? Should I have tried this transfusion? Should I have tried this or that? And still knowing in the end that I made the right choice, but it just, it's really, I remember feeling like there was a piece of my heart and my soul and my limbs lifted from me when she was gone. And I think we would all, unfortunately, the world is not yet ready to care for us in the time of grief over a pet in the way that, well, I mean, the world really isn't prepared to care for us in the wake of losing a relative either, honestly, but it's especially unprepared to. So I would say be extremely mindful, friends, when you lose an animal, to treat that grief as seriously as you would treat the grief of losing a family member. You may not be able to take time off work for bereavement, unfortunately, but you can still be kind to yourself. You can still give yourself space to go through the wailing, the lamentations, the brain fog that comes with grief, the dropping the commitments, the being unfriendly and unhelpful for a while. I mean, grieving people are not easy to be around, and so you may not be friendly, super. I know when I'm grieving, I make the most inappropriate comments. I'm just awful. I can't help it. I'm snarky, and I think I'm being funny, and everyone's like, "Oh, that was really dark." I'm like, "Oh, was it? I didn't even notice." So I think we have to take care of ourselves, and also when people lose an animal, to reach out to them with the same kind of kindness and support that you would reach out if somebody had lost a relative. A friend of mine, many years ago, she was an organizer of a very large arts community. So she had a lot of people around her all the time. And her family dog, who no longer lived with her, but she'd grown up with it, was put to sleep. And she'd mentioned that she was very sad and stuff like that. And I called her and said, "Hey, I just wanted to see how you're doing after Walter's death." And she, despite the fact that she had hundreds of people around her all the time, not one person expressed condolences for
Wow.
Walter the Golden Retriever. And I couldn't believe that. It's like, here's this woman who's, and it also made me angry because she created such a profound space for so many people that people couldn't take the time to call her, email her. This was before texting was really a thing, because it was just the thumb thing, and we didn't have the keyboards yet, so texting was not as prolific. But nobody would take the time, after she spent every week creating space for people to support their art, that people couldn't send her something or buy her a beer at the next thing and say, "I know you like beer, here's a beer in honor of Walter." Like, just
Oh,
it
yeah.
cost it was or just to say, give them offer and say, it cost me nothing to give her a call and say, "I'm so sorry to hear about Walter. That's devastating." That's nothing skin off me, and it meant everything to her. But and it's with my last cat that passed away. My grief over her has been kind of complicated. She died just a few days after my daughter was born. And she was very old and had been very sick for a long time. And so there was a piece of relief when she was gone.
Yeah.
But I kind of struggled a bit today at the vet appointment for my one of my still living cat, because I'm looking at the weight chart of cats and saw that my cat had started on like the fattest category. Like, oh my God, put your cat on a diet now. She was like born from New York City alley cat, so Darwinism was not going to let her be skinny ever. But when she got cancer, she moved from being the fattest cat on the chart to the skinniest cat on the chart. And just seeing that and thinking about how much she was suffering and how I really wasn't available for her in her last days of life, because I had a newborn, and that is a kind of sadness I have not really had a chance to grieve. But that. And even when I was putting her, my husband and I took her to the vet to be euthanized, my baby was staying at home with my mom. And, I want to be present for this cat who I'd had for 14 years. The same time in the back of my head, I'm like, I have a newborn. I need to get home. I need to get home. Where's the doctor? Where's the doctor? And having that guilt of not wanting to rush my cat's death process. But being torn by needs for the living. But
Yeah.
I like to think she stuck around just to see me deliver safely, and then she checked out, because
Yeah,
she died
that's
literally 2 days after I came home with the baby. She's
oh.
like, "Yeah, I'm done here."
Yeah, I that mirrors a lot of some of my experiences as well. I am the so quails are kind of in that weird pet category. People are like, you can have quails as a pet. It's like, yeah, actually, and the ones I had were rescues, and they were extremely affectionate, very social, very affectionate, big personalities, very cat-like, honestly, and
Mhm.
their lifespan in the wild is about 2 years. In captivity, it's 3 to 5. Well, I'm convinced it was from love, honestly, because they were such a huge part of my life, and they lived both of them about 10 years old.
Wow.
So I don't longer than any bobwhite quail on record, and
They're
so I
like, yeah, screw the Rainbow Bridge. We're staying here because, oh my God, have you had the food in this place?
exactly. And it was actually my quail Pumpkin, and I went into the vet, and he was obviously developing health issues, and he developed like a lot of tumors, and osteoporosis, all of these things. And the vet's like, wow, I remember they were like, he's got a few days to live, let him eat whatever he wants. Well, that whatever he wanted diet lasted for over 2 years.
Mm.
Um, so it's because before that, because he was also having some digestive problems, he was like on a special diet and like, all this medication. And the doctor's like, let's just keep him on, something for the inflammation and pain meds and whatever he wanted to eat. And he was like, I'll stick around for a couple more years, and, but yeah, I really, I think from the outside perspective, losing such a companion like that might not mean anything to other people, but they were definitely a huge part of my life. So
Yeah.
yeah. But yeah,
And
having an ancestor altar to them, and I know in your book you mentioned too, there's a ritual you offer for people, specifically for pets, that I think was also really awesome. Just such a great resource for sure.
oh, I appreciate that. And yeah, it's I remember having a conversation. This is where I doubt she'll listen to this, but if she does, please know I'm saying this with love. So my I'm the witch in the family, which having a side of the family that's super Christian makes them very nervous. And I have one aunt who is particularly very devout, born again, evangelical Christian. And I know she's really struggled with my faith and my path and my publicity and all of that. Um, and at the same time, she also recognized that of all the cousins, I'm the one that showed up the most for my grandmother. And when she didn't have children, she had a dog and loved that dog. And when the dog died, it, dog died, I think, not too long after my grandmother passed away, for whom she was the primary caregiver. So she had this enormous hole in her life from her mother and her dog. And twice she told me the story of the dog's, bucket list and his final days. She told me twice. And I listened both times without saying, "Oh yeah, you told me about that." Just listened to her, and that
Hmm.
she appreciated so much that she had someone who showed up and listened instead of just kind of patting her hand and go, "He's with Jesus now," and moving on.
Yeah.
Just giving her the space to listen, to hear the story you know, euthanizing her dog, which was incredible. It was an incredible gift she gave him, and also one that was absolutely devastating for her to do. And but that's where I think being a witch can be very helpful in that way, is
Yeah.
that we're showing up with no agenda. We're not showing up because I'm trying to convert her to my way of being or convince her of anything that has to do, just being present for her in the wake of this really great loss, and recognizing that it was a great loss for her.
Hmm.
Where clearly she wasn't getting that from the people in her community,
Yeah.
sadly.
Yeah, that's a wonderful reminder of how important we are to not just our magical communities, but also those outside of it as well, and how, we can be a comfort to all kinds of people. That's a beautiful reminder. Um, and so near the end of, so we talked about this in the beginning, this idea of getting over it, and you return to this idea at the end of your book. So there are ideas out there, I'm sure we've all experienced them at some point, where you're supposed to just stop feeling that loss anymore and that pain, as if nothing ever happened, and you just return back to your status quo of being okay and not being affected by this. You say, however, that no one truly gets over a loss, and instead we adjust to grief. Could you talk more about what you mean by that?
Yeah, so you know, getting over it is something that other people say because they don't want you to have. Sometimes it comes from a good place, as unkind as it is, because they don't want to see you suffer.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's because they don't want to suffer, and they want you to be the person that they knew you to be before because that's more convenient for them. Um, we don't get over great losses. Um, they change us. We're not the same people as we were before the loss. I know I was not. I can definitely mark a huge change in my life for when I got my heart broken in a relationship.
Mm.
That was who I was before that heartbreak and who I am after are two very different things. Does that heartbreak still haunt me? No, I don't. But I wouldn't say that I ever got over it because even though I don't long for this person, I recognize that I'm not the same person that
Hmm.
I was. So it would not really be to say that, oh, I just got over it. I'm like, no, I moved through my life with this part of my story, and I no longer suffer over this loss. I no longer long for the person that I was with. Um, you know, but I recognize that I was changed. I don't love the
Yeah.
same as I did before. In many ways, I think I love better. And, I think that having had that heartbreak made me ultimately a better partner for, for my husband, who I met not too long after that heartbreak. I don't think I would have been the same partner if I had not experienced that heartbreak
Hmm.
because it made me look at myself and just change the way I approached love. So I couldn't really call that, I mean, to get over it means that I can live my life as though this never happened. And that's just not possible, and it's the same thing with having lost our child. Like, I'm not gonna I don't cry over it anymore. I don't wake up in the morning in suffer over this loss anymore. But I'm not the same person as I was before the loss. I think it's probably ultimately made me a better parent when I did have my daughter, because I personally know what life is like without her. So in moments when things are really awful, like because sometimes raising a toddler can be really tough, I find I don't get as overwhelmed as I personally might have before. Um, Messes don't bother me the way they probably would have once before. It's just a different, but that because I don't, but you don't get over something. It changes you when you've really lost something, and some parts of those changes can be beautiful. Um, and some of them maybe you won't always be thankful for them, but you move through. You just you to say get over it means you can live as though it's never happened and it no longer affects you. But every single day, every single one of my great losses affects me, but not necessarily in a way in which I suffer.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah,
So,
and I love how you put it. Choosing healing is not necessarily choosing to get over it. So,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and that's something um I do believe that time can help us. Time makes healing easier. Time's role is not to do all the healing. So time heals all wounds is not true. I think we also need to recognize that there are things we need to do for ourselves. Um, like again, the broken leg analogy, time would not heal a broken leg.
Yeah.
Time plus support and intention for healing heals a broken leg, but still that leg is never going to be the same. But it can still be functional. Um, and it may be almost as functional as was before, but I'm sure the person who's broken the leg is still always going to be aware that break happened, but it's
Hmm.
not going to consume them forever.
Yeah, wonderful points. Yeah, I think this has been an absolutely amazing conversation. Of course, for all of our viewers and listeners, all of those links are below where to purchase the book, all of that. So, my question for you, Courtney, sort of wrapping this up, if people are interested in following you, where is the best way to do that? And do you have any upcoming projects you're super excited about?
Yeah, so I'm so happy this is coming out on the 24th. So that I've got a new virtual series that's starting this Sunday, the 27th.
Yes.
It's a three-part class. It's called Hecate and the Healing Journey. So it's about building your healing journey with Hecate, with the inclusion of Hecate mythology and what pick your word, worship, integration, relationship with, and however you can create that create your relationship with that goddess as your goalpost for healing. And that is a three-part class that is all recorded. So if you can't join me live, you will get the recordings if you purchase the tickets. The best way to find me and to get more information about that class is to go to CourtneyAWeber.com. Top of the bar is where you can click on classes and events, and that's where you can register for the Hecate class. I also do tarot readings by Zoom and by email. Again, go to CourtneyAWeber.com. That's where you can find that information. I have a magical learning platform for people who are looking to get deeper into their witchcraft practice, to return to their witchcraft practice after a hiatus, or use witchcraft principles and tarot principles to make some really powerful, profound changes in their life. That is currently being hosted through Patreon. It's called The Cauldron Calling. Again, patreon.com/Courtney A. Weber, and you can find that there. And I'm on Instagram and TikTok a lot. Courtney A. Weber. That's Weber with one B. And so I really encourage people to find me in those places. And I have a biweekly Substack that, so I've got all kinds of content out there. Facebook and the platform formerly known as Twitter, I'm not on there very much, but Instagram, TikTok, and my website, Courtney A. Weber, is where you can find me.
And you got a podcast too, right?
Oh yeah, that's right. I have a podcast. Oh my God. My podcast is called That Witch Life. And it is released weekly. It's me with my two best friends from high school. We're all witches. And so it is a 45-minute conversation with a witchcraft expert and 30 minutes of dumpster fire. So
Right.
if you need a dose of, wow, these women are just bonks, then that's what you've got. If you also need the, wow, this person really knows what they're talking about. We always interview a witchcraft expert on all of our episodes. And first time I've talked about this since the con is that we are producing an in-person con in the Pacific Northwest in May called Spirit Northwest. So get your workshop proposals ready.
Yay.
Come out to Oregon.
Yes, wonderful. I actually will be up in Oregon next year for
Okay.
Noticon. So I'll have to say hello if I'm near you.
Give us a holler. Yeah.
All right, wonderful. So this has been absolutely fantastic. I hope everyone's benefited from this. I'm sure everyone has. All the links will be below in the description. And thank you so very much, Courtney, for sharing your time and energy with me today.
Likewise, I'm always happy to talk with you, and I'm glad to see you again.
Likewise. So, thank you to all of our viewers and listeners for making this possible. And as always, I am the center of expression for the primal will to good, and so are you. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.